Magnifique!
Yeah, so I think I might just stick with woodworking. As you may have noticed, in this video, I'm going to build this easel. It's fairly inexpensive and doesn't require much in the way of construction. And I've made it out of European beech, which is a relatively inexpensive hardwood. It was actually cheaper for me to get this than pine from the local big box store. With that said, let's jump into the video and watch how I made it. Getting started, I'm going to cut my timber to rough length for the legs, which are 1600mm or roughly 63 inches, and the front mast, which is 1500mm or roughly 59 inches. I've chosen European beech for this project, mainly because it's one of the cheaper hardwoods I can buy, and it's even cheaper than buying dressed pine from my local big box store. Interestingly, I noticed that the majority of the easels I looked at for inspiration all seem to be made out of beech as well, which is a pure coincidence. With my timber cut to rough length, I took it over to the jointer to clean up two sides. Then I converted my jointer into a thicknesser to bring the timber down to final thickness of 22mm or just under an inch. One of the problems with having a small workshop is things don't always fit the way you want. But luckily my extractor is on wheels, so I was able to move it out of the way for the timber to fit through the thicknesser unimpeded. Pretty much all the parts of the easel are going to be 60mm or roughly 2 1/3 of an inch wide. So after dressing the timber on three sides, I ripped everything down to the correct width. The legs of this easel will splay out from the top, so we need to cut that specific angle on the bottoms of the legs to ensure the bottom of each leg is parallel to the ground. We're going to join the legs together with a top and a bottom support member, and we're going to use half lap joints to connect it all together. To make the half lap joints, I'm going to use the trenching feature of my drop saw, which essentially allows you to control how far down the blade can come. And in this case, I've set the depth to come exactly halfway through the wood. I can then mark on the legs where the joints will be and use multiple cuts to slowly trench out the area for the joint. One issue to be aware of is that with the depth set, you'll notice that the blade won't reach the end of your workpiece. You'll get a sort of ramp there. The fix for this is super easy. Just find a scrap piece of wood to offset your workpiece from the fence and you should be good to go. I forgot to film it, but it's a great idea to use a couple of scrap pieces of wood to get the depth of your blade set to exactly halfway through the wood. It sucks getting the depth wrong on your actual workpieces. When you're getting near the edge of your trench, use a scrap piece of wood to sneak up on the perfect friction fit. A handy tip to ensure you get a nice clean edge on your trench is to use a blade to cut along your measurements. This severs the wood fibres in a much cleaner manner than the saw can. The reverse trench is then cut in the support members, and finally I took a chisel to them to clean up the surfaces a bit. Then, with the half laps cut in the legs and the support members, it's time for a quick dry fit to ensure everything is fitting together well. You'll notice that the half laps on the support members protrude past the legs. This is on purpose, and I'm going to use a router and a flush trim bit to clean them up later, and this will help with imperfections in my measurements. Next up, we want to make the centre mast, and we're going to attach this using half lap joints just like the legs. These half laps will be in the exact centre of both top and bottom supports, and will be on the reverse side to the leg joints, mainly for aesthetic reasons. An alternative to cleaning up the bottom of the trench with a chisel is to carefully move the workpiece from side to side with the blade fully down. Just be careful of the edges and your fingers. While I've been mainly working on measurements from the SketchUp plans I've made, to mark the position of the half lap on the top support, I first cut the half lap for the bottom, then dry fit it all together, and mark the position while in place. This helps account for any mismeasurements or other changes that may have happened. Then, after cutting the final half lap, I double check the fit and everything is looking great. One last thing I want to do with the legs and the centre mast is to round the ends over. To do this, I start off by cutting a thin piece of MDF to the width of the legs, and I use a protractor to mark a circle at the end. I then use my disc sander to sand up to the protractor lines, making sure I have a nice semicircle at the end. I've basically just made a pattern for a pattern bit to follow. This particular bit is in really bad condition and I had some issues with it jumping, which was a bit dangerous, so I've since replaced it with a new one. So all we need to do now is clamp the pattern in place over the workpiece and route the corners off, allowing the ball bearing on the router bit to follow the pattern. One note I found about routing end grain: make sure you're routing towards the end of the grain. If you start at the end and try and route into it, you're more likely to have issues with your blade catching, especially if the bit is not as sharp as it should be. And this is me learning this lesson the hard way. Luckily, I didn't hurt myself. So after that hiccup, I made sure to flip each piece over and only route in one direction. It's almost time to glue everything up, but before doing so, I give all the edges a quick sand, as they'll be harder to sand when everything is glued together. Glue up with this one is nice and easy, starting with gluing and clamping the legs to the top and bottom support members, followed by gluing in the centre mast. Now we can move on to the bottom canvas holder. We're basically making a C-channel here with 3 pieces of wood. So taking 3 of my offcuts, I cut them all to the length of 550mm or roughly 21.5 inches, using a poor man's stop block to ensure they're all exactly the same length. None of these pieces are the same width as the legs they were offcuts from, so it's over to the table saw to rip each piece down to its desired width. It's looking pretty good so far, but it feels a bit chunky, so I take the pieces over to the thicknesser and bring them down to 15mm or just over half an inch. With all the pieces the same length and thicknesses, they're ready for a simple glue up. I did have a bit of an issue with the pieces sliding around here. I probably should have used some brad nails, at least from the back, to help hold things in place. The bottom canvas holder needs to be able to slide up and down the centre mast and be able to be fixed at any point. To do this, we're going to have a saddle to go around the mast and have some bolts that go through the canvas holder into the saddle, and they will have wing nuts that can be tightened or undone to allow for the movement of the holder to go up and down. One important note is that the sides of the saddle must be slightly thinner than that of the centre mast, otherwise the saddle won't actually clamp onto the mast. Conversely, the gap between the sides must be wider than that of the centre mast, otherwise it'll either have too much friction or won't fit at all. Marking holes on the saddle, we want to make sure that the holes are dead centre with the sides. And as usual, I'm using a brad point bit to be as accurate as possible when drilling my holes. I then use the saddle as a reference to mark the holes on the canvas holder. So I need to feed these bolts through the tray to be able to attach this to the easel. And to keep things nice and flush, I had intended to recess the head of these into the tray. But I should have done the recess before I glued everything up, because as you can see, I've got my pilot hole there and I can't actually reach it with my force niblet. It's not the end of the world, it just means this bolt's gonna sit proud a little bit there, but yeah, if you're doing this yourself, make sure you drill the holes before you glue it together, and then you'll get the chance to recess this and make it look a bit nicer. With the holes drilled in the canvas holder, I can seat the bolts in the holder, giving them a light tap with the hammer, and test how it all works. I gotta say, I was pretty happy with how that came together. The next part to make is the top canvas holder, which essentially clamps the canvas in place from the top. This is made from a bunch of fiddly pieces that I cut to size on the chop saw and the table saw. Instead of having a loose saddle, this will essentially be a closed sleeve that'll slot over the top of the centre mast. You'll see what I mean soon. Because this is a little bit fiddly, I'm going to glue it up in a few stages. The first stage to glue together is the front, which will act as the grip for the canvas, and it'll be where the knob goes. There are actually 3 pieces of wood to glue together on the front, but I'm only gluing 2 of them first, and I'm using some brad nails to secure them while the glue dries, because when we add the 3rd piece, it'll hide those brads. The second stage is the back saddle, again getting the glue and brad treatment. So the way this top support is going to be attached to the easel is going to be a little bit different to the bottom tray. We're going to adjust this a lot more often, and so I want a knob at the front rather than at the back to help for adjustment. So what we're going to do is, instead of making this straddle a little bit thinner so you can pull it together, we're going to make it a bit thicker than the size of the wood here. And we're going to glue it in so it's a single piece. Then we're going to put this knob through the front here, and that will screw in against this piece here, holding it in place. So in order for this to screw in, we need some sort of nut at the back. I don't know what the name of these things are, but we're going to put this at the back there, and we're going to drill a hole through the front and be able to screw it in through that nut thing. But there's a couple of points here. First off is we need to recess this into the back here. So we're going to use a force niblet to do that. Also, the knob I managed to get does not protrude a lot through the back there. It might be enough, but just in case, I'm going to also cut a recess in the front there so the knob can sit in and just go a little bit further out the back there. So off to the drill press. Or at least it would have been off to the drill press had I pressed record on the camera. Regardless, with the recess in place on the back of the front plate, I can now hammer the T-nut into place. Now the adjustment knob can be screwed in, and you can see it just pokes out the back of the front plate. Another feature I've noticed on easels is a small 5mm groove in the bottom of the top canvas holder. I presume this is to hold thin canvases in place. I'm going to use the table saw to do this, so I set the blade height to about 5mm and I set the fence so the blade will cut just off centre of the workpiece. Then I can run the piece over the blade from both sides, giving me a perfect groove. With the groove cut, I can finally glue the top canvas holder together. I'm just using glue and clamps here as I don't want any visible brad nails on the finished product. I'm also trying not to use too much glue here as I want to avoid any glue squeeze out in places that are hard to get to. While the top canvas holder is drying, it's a good time to go back to the main frame and give it a quick sand as we're on the home stretch. Now we can come back to tidying up our lap joints. I'm just using a flush trim bit here to shave away the excess wood. Doing it this way gives us a much cleaner look instead of trying to cut the joints to size before gluing. Next up, it's time to attach the back leg. I'm using a pretty basic gate hinge here as it feels pretty sturdy and it's about the same width as the easel legs. I'm attaching the hinge flush with the top leg support as this gives good stability and it won't interfere with the top or bottom canvas holders. I'm screwing the leg into place, making sure to pre-drill my holes first and also ensuring that the leg is perfectly in line with the centre mast. With the back leg in place, I can now mark its length by drawing a line between the two front legs. Then I can detach it and cut it to final length on the drop saw. I'd originally planned to hold the back leg in place with a pivot piece of wood here, but I glued everything up before I remembered to drill the hole, so I'm not going to do that anymore. Instead, I'm going to do the classic piece of rope in the bottom. It's not going to look as elegant, but it'll do the trick and it'll be way easier than trying to route holes through this back leg. For the piece of rope, I just clamped the back leg to the centre mast, adding a scrap piece of wood in between and behind to prevent any blowout. Then I drill a hole right through the whole lot. Next up, I thread some rope through the holes, tying a knot in the front to prevent it from pulling through. Then I move the easel to the floor, cut the rope to what feels like a good position, and tie another knot to set the extent of the back leg. And finally, to finish the easel, I'm using a wipe-on poly, mainly because it's what I had on hand, but I also figured it didn't matter too much as it's likely to get covered in paint eventually. Well, that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.